I'd like to thank and welcome our honorable trustee members of the BOT-IUB, our beloved students, our faculty and staff members, the participants and the discussants who will present their papers, and friends from the media and everyone present among us today. We would like to begin the program by reflecting on the lessons from COP27. May we have Mr. Praveen Pratap Singh Pardesi on the stage to take us through those reflections. Mr. Pardesi is an Indian Administrative Service Officer and has held senior leadership positions in the United Nations as the global head of UNDP Geneva. He has been a key player in post-conflict recovery programs in various regions. Sir.
Can I have the PowerPoint? There is a PowerPoint which. So, Karishma, can we have the PowerPoint up? Yeah, thank you. Does it move from this? So first, it gives me great joy to be here. Balipura Foundation has really done an amazing job of getting us all together on this platform to talk about these issues. Let's reflect on what COP can give us and what it cannot, as Ambassador Shamasaran told us yesterday. Between Bangladesh and India, we share such a long border. You can use the UN framework for Convention for Climate Change, which I'll talk about, and also the Convention on Biological Diversity and on Migratory Species. So these are areas where we can collaborate. On the biodiversity, we have various conventions, and on the climate change is the COP. But let's start from the issue which I think Ambassador Sharan mentioned yesterday. Before that, let me get to what's the target? What would I like to really put forward to you? So all of us need to restore nearly 30% of our ecosystems back to rewilding. And rewilding is not, as I was mentioning to my colleague from Tata's, planting trees, because that's sometimes even negative. It's really getting what nature grows in that area to come back. And a lot of it happens when we allow areas to remain wild, protected from human hand. The seeds, these rootstock is still there. But when we plant artificial trees, we not only create a big carbon drain, but we also destroy the local biodiversity. So it's basically about 30% areas of the country to go back to natural ecosystems. But India and Bangladesh are divided, at least the people are divided by political boundaries. But I really came to this conference because, birds don't recognize this. We in BNHS did a study, and this bird, which is the skimmer, I don't think this one, sorry. So this bird came all the way from Chambal River to one Nijum Dweep in Bangladesh. So this is the extent to which ecosystems don't recognize political boundaries, and we need to follow them. And are we following them? So this is my real joy. Balipara Foundation is like that skimmer. It works across all the countries and tries to really integrate the natural ecosystem. And that was the point. I think I keep repeating what Ambassador Sharan was saying, that we may have a climate adaptation plan for Bangladesh, for India, but rivers don't respect boundaries. Mountains bring up all the deluge. If they are not forested, whatever we do in Bangladesh will not help. If the stream flow data of the rivers up in the mountains doesn't reach in time to places downstream, we cannot prepare for floods. In fact, I was there in the Bangladesh floods during 2005 or 6, if I remember right. And early warning requires that countries across the borders share not just rainfall, but stream flow data, so that you can, and that's one collaboration which has started. But as you can see, we are far away from the 30%. And like this bird, which I photographed on the Brahmaputra River, which fishes across, whether it's in Bangladesh or India, we need to work across borders. So that's the first lesson. Now, what do we get from COP? We all talk about the great breakthrough that there is loss and damage funds for vulnerable countries, and we always been talking that we have not created this crisis, but we are bearing the brunt of it. So it identifies this, and other than the common but differentiated responsibility, it says that it will set aside resources. Now, this again is a very interesting issue, which generally not very easy to believe in. There was $100 billion fund in the last COP, and I was just tracking it. I don't think that in any year it exceeded 50 billion. But of that 50 billion, more than two-thirds was basically loans from multi-development banks, which you would have got in any case if you had accessed them. So a lot of this work, this statement, as the Economist reports this time, is a bit ambiguous and fuzzy. So the basic lesson from COP is that what COP says is not really what is applicable to us. So then should we just sit around and wait? So these animals are not going to wait. This is the Sundarbans tiger, which moves across. But fortunately, we still share him between the Bangladesh and both the Sundarbans. But the rhinos are still remaining only in the Indian part of the Brahmaputra, while they were here before. Can we do something about this? Yes, locally we can do something about it. So if you look at the top part, across the Bhutan and Assam border, there is a common park, which is the Manas, which shares boundaries with both. But here we have Dampa, which is in northeastern India, but on the Bangladesh side, there is a big border. And just like I saw Kruger National Park being opened up between Mozambique and South Africa, and the elephants moved across, this is one big opportunity for a peace park. Here, fortunately, there are no borders in the Sundarbans, and tigers still move out, but there's a lot of cooperation possible. But then again, we'll ask, is there enough funding for biodiversity? Because the theme of today is ecology is economics. And by the way, I don't believe in all the externalities. That's too much jaded. Everybody knows all these things. We've been talking about it since school days, that you have the huge externality of climate change. And therefore, what do we do? And we talk to the world and we keep talking. So people have found solutions for that. And these are the solutions which we can all do. So all of these things, I think, can be implemented and financed locally without waiting for any COP funds. And we have done this exactly. So let me come up with an example how it can be done. So this is an example from Tadoba National Park. And here, the tigers are paying for ecosystems. So how are they paying that? You know, tigers take lives. So this particular tigress killed about 5 women and had to be shot, which was very sad. But tigers give life. If all we need to do is to manage that correctly. So you see the huge amount of tourists which are coming here. And this is the story of how Tadoba and every single park in Maharashtra has transformed today. So every single tiger is paying for more than 100,000 women in terms of giving her life. So today, if you go in the surroundings of Tadoba, every woman, much before the Prime Minister's Ujjwala Yojana, has a cooking stove funded by the tiger directly. How did he fund it? All the user charges, which were only up to 17 lakhs or $21,000, not only did I raise the fees, entry fees, but made it digital entry points so that nobody could jump the queue. And today, Tadoba or Pench is overbooked for the next 6 months. We even did something else which I wanted to tell you. So this money which came in, we didn't put in the general government resources. We put it back in the Tiger Foundation, divided between managing the tigers, but 50% going to people living outside the park who were paying in terms of lives and lifelong lost. But that still doesn't help, because when a farmer works outside and a tiger kills his cattle or a deer enters his farm, no amount of saying that, you got some money from this will help you. So we did a second intervention. on human dominated landscapes, which I think is possible everywhere. So this is that intervention. So all the forest outside, we farmed out to local villages in terms of tourism routes. So this is one route outside the park. And this earns something like $1 million to the local village. It's only their gypsy owners and only their young one can go as a guide. So it's a monopolized by that village. So we have now about 18 villages which surround the park who earn their keep by showing wilderness, which is non-extractive. And this creates more income than coal mining or other types of things in this. So my big question in all of this is, yes, we can work together, we can talk together across the world, keep shouting about that we didn't create the climate change, we are suffering from it. Yes, that will happen. But finally, if nothing happens on that front, I think all of us together can convert ecosystem services into something which can fund local development. The key point is people cut down forests or cut down biodiversity because they can't convert an asset into a recurring income source. The income that people are getting around Tadoba from rice cultivation is roughly 5,000 rupees a year. It's so small compared to the value of what that ecosystem is. But there's no way to realize the value personally by a local owner. What we did is converted rewilding into an income opportunity for local owners of that land. And that is one example. There are many such examples which we can do, which ensures that an ecosystem as a whole can give a recurring source of livelihood, and it should be non-extractive. All this talk of taking out fruits, vegetables, tendu, the type of population India and Bangladesh has, no forests in India can sustain extractive livelihoods anymore. I've seen it. I've been Secretary Forest in Maharashtra for 5 years. I've been Secretary to Chief Minister. No forests in India can any longer sustain the 350 million people by extractive livelihoods. But if you see whether it's Switzerland or any other country, they are using their outdoors for non-extractive. Whether it is skiing, trekking, hiking, is totally non-extractive. And I think India and Bangladesh can build this whole new genre of livelihoods, which will get restoration of ecosystems to pay for themselves for local people's livelihoods. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pardeshi, sir, for sharing such a wonderful presentation with all of us. And now, before starting off with the first panel discussion, I would like to request our tech team to play a video message by Lord Nicholas Stern, the Chair, Grantham Research Institute, London School of Economics, UK. Can we have the video, please?
Professor Nick Stern, thank you so much for joining us at the forum. You recently returned from a couple weeks of hard work at COP. Can you just give us your impressions now that the dust has settled a little bit? Where do you think the world ended up at the end of that 2 weeks?
I think it's very important to distinguish between the agreement that comes out at the end and all the activities that take place. And now that second part of the story is of significance. It was at Glasgow where the private sector came in big numbers and made commitments and had detailed discussions about what could be done and what they could do. It's a place where countries can work out with international institutions, with potential investors, what they might be able to do, and they can also set out their plans. So on those kinds of fronts, on the private sector, on technology, on movement forward, on country plans, I think there was a lot going on in Sharm el Sheikh. The agreement itself, I think, was fairly limited. One very important step forward was the creation of a fund for loss and damage. Now we have to think of loss and damage as how a country copes or can cope or is helped to cope with extreme events, both ex ante and ex post. And that is something which has been on the agenda for a long time, perhaps 3 decades. And finally, it was recognized much more strongly than before, and a fund for loss and damage was set up. My concern, though, is that it's all right to have a fund, but are you going to get very much in the fund? And I fear that that's going to be a real problem. On other fronts, the agreement was really not.
Professor Nick Stern, thank you so much
the
for joining us
tightening of
at the
ambition,
forum.
which was so necessary.
You recently
and
returned
was
from
necessary
a couple
for
weeks of hard work
was
at
not
COP.
really there.
Can you just give us your impressions
which was very good,
now that the dust has settled a little bit? Where do
add
you
to
think the
phasing
world
down of
ended up
coal,
at the end of
phasing
2
down
weeks?
of
I think it's very important to distinguish
did not appear. So that's an example. So I think apart from the loss and damage, which was of significance, but we'll have to see how big that fund is, it did not move very far on the agreement itself. But I do think there was a lot going on. My own participation there was particularly in association with a report which was requested by the 2 presidencies, COP26, COP27, UK and Egypt, for a report on the climate finance that was necessary to deliver on Paris. So we, Vera Songway and I, working very closely with Amar Bhattacharya, we set that out. We spoke about flows of $1 trillion a year to emerging markets and developing economies by 2030, necessary to finance the investment which is necessary for delivery on Paris. And we showed how that could be generated, the majority from the private sector, but with a big role for the multilateral development banks, and argued that that should be, their flows from the MDBs should be multiplied by a factor of 3 within 5 years for this overall set of flows, including, of course, private sector, to be realized. So that's an example. A lot of discussion around finance, a lot of discussion around private sector. India set out a very good long-term strategy that was announced there. I participated in that session. At Bali, the G20, which more or less simultaneous, China and the United States announced that they would resume official discussions around climate, which had been suspended following Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan earlier in the year. So they came back together. So outside the COP, on technology, on private sector, on finance, on some of the country plans, I think a lot did happen. The agreement itself, apart from the loss and damage story, I don't think really added up to very much.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in there that's going to be relevant for the people in the audience today who are representing people on the front lines of climate solutions in one of the most climate vulnerable places on Earth. So I want to come back to a few of those things and what people should take away from what your feedback on COP and put into their own work. But I want to also just quickly, if you can, look backwards and explain your long connection to this region. It's a place that you know well, where you have very active relationships. But can you tell us about your sort of early connection to South Asia, how that got started, and how you think things have changed in this sort of climate debate over the years?
Thank you, Jason. I've been, I have to struggle to keep this short, but I've been coming to India and working in India and living in India for periods since 1974. So 48 going on 49 years now. I've worked in different ways. I worked in a village in UP, in Moradabad district, a village called Palanpur, and we've published 3 books on that village. And we have data going back to the 1950s, and we've been collecting data ourselves ever since 1974 and watching how that village and trying to understand how that village changes. I worked very closely on tax issues, indeed very early on in the 1980s on value-added tax, which, you know, with some lag did appear in India after a long period of time. Over the last nearly 20 years, I've been particularly involved in the whole climate story, working very closely in different ways with Ranjit Bhattakur and Bitu Sagal, but also with the Indian government. And what we've seen in that period is for a long time, India on the public stage saying quite understandably that the rich countries were particularly culpable in emitting greenhouse gases over a very long period of time, that they got rich through dirty growth and climate damaging growth, and that India had contributed very little, so that India would find its own way and the rich countries had to take the lead. So there's a bit of pushback, but I think that has been changing over the last few years, and Prime Minister Modi's landmark speech at COP26 in Glasgow a year ago now set out a new approach to growth for India. That's been building over time. India has recognized, of course, how vulnerable India is to climate change. India recognizes what is obvious, that it is a big country that's getting bigger in terms of the economy and therefore its footprint. But India has also is also recognizing and demonstrating how valuable the alternatives are, that the clean is cheaper than the dirty across a great front, and that India is at the heart of the world's ecology, and that there's so much that India can do on that front as well. And of course, that climate and biodiversity are not really separate subjects. There's no competition, one and the other, that natural capital is absolutely key part of action on climate change, adaptation and resilience, and of course, avoiding emissions and capturing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So that those recognitions in the recent period of the new model of growth, the alternatives to growth, that the clean is better than the dirty, and of the centrality of biodiversity along with and interwoven with climate change, all that has moved in the last few years, and India is now becoming a leader on the world stage on these issues. And it's tremendous that India's G20 presidency is coming now, because India can really take that leadership one stage forward.
Yeah, that G20 presidency is something that a lot of people are going to be talking about here at the forum over the next couple of days. And now that the India government has set out a very pro-nature for climate and for people agenda at the center of their G20 presidency, it's something that our partners in Bangladesh, in the northeast of India, and Bhutan and Nepal are all thinking about how we might be able to come together to achieve something that's bigger than the sum of its parts and take advantage of the huge opportunity that this historic G20 presidency is really going to give us. So I appreciate your comments about the G20, because I think it's a real chance to focus people's mind around these topics. And for India, a country, again, on the front line of climate change, to stand up and show we've actually got the answers, we've got the solutions here, and we now need the support to get on with them and to set that kind of example. On that point around nature-based solutions and the valuing of natural assets, when you and Sir Partha and others first started talking about these things, I'm sure it was a bit of an uphill struggle with some of your more traditional colleagues. How do you feel now? Do you think actually we're not having to do as much explaining about when we're talking about the real fundamental value of nature? Is it better than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And where do you think we've landed on that?
The discussion is much better than 10 years or so ago. What worries me is the sense of urgency. The next 10 years are absolutely decisive. And I think the argument is in a much better place about the centrality of biodiversity and the critical challenge of climate change and the interweaving of those two things. We're a much better place in terms of the substance of the argument, but I worry that the sense of urgency is really not there when you describe how much we have to invest in clean infrastructure. When we talk about how much and how quickly we have to invest in clean infrastructure, of how fast we have to move in looking after our forests and and planting and restoring degraded land. That part of the story I don't think has really got through sufficiently strongly. This next 10 years is decisive. We can put 1.5 or even 2 degrees out of reach by what we do in the next 5 or 10 years in natural capital, in physical capital. And I worry that whilst we've done quite well with the argument, that sense of urgency in what we have to do quickly is not yet there. And that's why some of us are working hard on trying to set out what's involved in delivering on Paris in terms of 3 broad areas: the physical capital side, particularly the energy transition, adaptation and resilience, and natural capital. And those are the 3 big areas that we underline in the Sonway Stern Bhattacharya report, which was published almost 2 weeks ago now, available on the Grantham Institute website. And we try to embody that sense of urgency and show what we have to do quickly.
I think the sense of urgency is something that's incredibly important, I think, for large parts of the conservation community who've been on the front line of these issues for many decades. It can be easy to fall into a bit of a business as usual. It's hard, you're chasing the next grant application, whatever it might be, but it's different now and it's upon us. And how we sort of channel that sense of urgency is something we're going to be talking about at the forum. But crucial to that, and facing these challenges dead on, is not becoming too pessimistic and despondent, because as you say, we know what we need to do, we have the plan. So I'm interested in your work. We've talked about the challenges, we've talked about some of the disappointments out of COP, which are all understandable, but what gives you a sense of optimism about where we are right now?
I think the attractions of this new approach to growth and development are really starting to appear to people. You know, cities where you can move and breathe sounds like a good idea, even if you've never heard of climate change. Ecosystems which are robust and fruitful. I think people have their understanding of the value of those to all of life, and of course specifically to resilience and to mitigation. I think those ideas that embody the notion that this is a new form of growth and development, and it's in our hands, and it's really attractive. People can see that mangroves are very good for capturing carbon, they're very good for the shrimps and the tigers and so on, and they're very good for development, and they're very good against storm surges. So I think people can see the general argument that this is a new form of development that's very attractive, and they can start to see the specifics of that, whether it's mangroves or restoring degraded land, looking after forests, building much cleaner energy and transport systems and so on. So I think people can see both the new model of growth and development, but also the attraction of some of the specifics. The problem, of course, is you've got to invest to get there. This new form of growth doesn't, drop out of the sky and land in your lap. You have to invest strongly to get there. You have to finance the investment. And I do think that that will be the central story in the G20 presidency of India. It was set out a year ago by Prime Minister Modi in very much his own way, of course, in Glasgow. He launched Lifestyle for the Environment. He's speaking about development for people and the planet. And I do think that all those lines of argument are really building up now. And I think President Lula is very much on the same page. And of course, the Brazilian G20 presidency follows the Indian. I hope very much that, and indeed South Africa follows Brazil. So that, 3 big democracies across continents are coming now in world leadership. And it will be those 3 countries that set the agenda for the coming years. No longer, I think, the G7. They're very important. They've got to be part of the story. But if you think who's going to set the agenda now for the coming 3 years, India, Brazil, South Africa, and I'm sure that they will work together to drive this whole story, this new model of growth forward.
Well, thank you so much for defining what that opportunity is, because as you say, we have a huge opportunity with the India G20 presidency and the 2 years that follow that. And it's now down to all of us to seize that opportunity and really act. So thank you very much for setting out your view and for giving us reasons to feel optimistic about what we can achieve as well. So thank you very much.
I'm very optimistic about what we can do. I worry a lot about what we will do, but that's the whole purpose of this kind of discussion and the activities and the ideas that can come from it. So I wish you the very best of luck for the 10th Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum.
Thank you so much, Lord Stern.
On behalf of the Center for Bay of Bengal Studies and the Balipara Foundation, we deeply thank Lord Nicholas Stern, the chair of Grantham Research Institute, London School of Economics, UK, for his precious message and all the reviews that we received from him. And now we'd like to start with the first theme of today's panel discussion that we all have been waiting for. It's understanding the economics of biodiversity. Now, all across the diverse geographic regions of the Eastern Himalayas, biodiversity loss and climate change has resulted in the region warming faster than the global average. The loss of forest cover and biodiversity, along with ecosystem degradation, means decreasing nature capital, which are assets such as land, forests, water, minerals, marine and terrestrial wildlife within fragile ecosystems. This poses major challenges towards sustainable development. And now, to hear more about this theme from our distinguished panelists and dignitaries, I would like to call up Sir Partho Sarathi Das Gupta, Frank Ramsey Emeritus Professor of Economics, University of Cambridge, UK. We have Mr. S. Ramadorai, former CEO and MD Tata Consultancy Services, India. A round of applause for them. Sir. We have His Excellency Sham Saran, former Foreign Secretary of India and Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change, India. A round of applause for him as well. And obviously, the moderator of this session, Ms. Afsara Binte Mirza, the lead of Environment and Climate Change Network Youth Policy Forum, to come up on the stage and take your seats, please. Thank you, everyone. So now I'd like to request Ms. Afsara Binte Mirza to moderate our first panel discussion. Thank you. All right. I'd like to request our people to have a microphone on stage, if that's possible, for the moderator of this session. Can anyone give me a microphone, please? Thank you.
Good morning to all of you. Assalamu alaikum and a warm welcome to all of you. I am Afsar Louisa, currently working as a lead of Environment and Climate Change Network at Youth Policy Forum and also a research officer at International Center for Climate Change and Development. Youth Policy Forum is an organization which reflects the aspirations of young people who wants to work on the sustainable development goals. It's my great pleasure to moderate this enticing session titled as Understanding the Economics of Biodiversity. This session will highlight the need to take the biodiversity crisis in the Eastern Himalayas seriously due to its integral role in enhancing climate resilience. This session will shed light on economic evaluation of nature and its integration with economic decision-making system. Without further ado, let me also introduce again Sir Partha Dasgupta, who is Frank Ramsey Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Cambridge. I also have with me His Excellency Sham Saran, who was a former Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change. I also have with me Mr. Ram Durai, former CEO and MD Tata Consultancy Services. As momentum is growing internationally on the need to value natural ecosystem, in 2020, the Dutch National Bank released its first biodiversity risk assessment report. And last year's Dasgupta's review commissioned by the UK Treasury systematically outlined how nature needs to be inclined in policy and economic decision making. Today, both the formal and informal forest sector employ over 86 million people globally, and many of them in small, medium enterprises. Directly investing in sustainable forest management globally will create an additional 16 million jobs by 2030. The next 10 years are imperative to place ecology and biodiversity at the heart of climate crisis to meet the region's growing climate threats to its water ecosystem, to its food ecosystem, and especially to keep the people who are left behind the farthest, rural communities at the heart of climate agenda. The Eastern Himalayas' rich biodiversity is a natural buffer against this threat. However, the key challenge is putting biodiversity on the regional policy agenda on par with climate crisis. So let me start with the panel discussion with a brilliant lineup of panelists. And first of all, I would like to ask all the panelists that how would you define the economics of biodiversity and why do you think it's the prime time to think about this? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me reasonably well up there? Okay, I'll try and keep the microphone in place. But it's a tall order, the question that you've asked. I recently published, 2 years ago, I published submitted to the Treasury, UK Treasury, the Economics of Biodiversity, or my version of it, with the outstanding team that the Treasury provided me. And I'd like to pay some tribute to an unusual funder, if you like, namely a finance ministry interested in biodiversity. It's a remarkable phenomenon, and they've been very supportive subsequent to the publication of the review, by maintaining part of my team for another full year for dissemination purposes. And of course, there were outstandingly good civil servants who worked with me. Some of them have now become my students, if you like. It's sufficiently senior to make that kind of a relationship work very well. So I can't answer your question in 5-10 minutes, obviously. But what I want to do is to point to the fact that once you recognize, and I mean this very seriously in the sense of really deeply recognize that the human economy, which means, of course, we, all of us, are embedded in nature. We are part of nature. We're not external to nature. We are not outsiders plucking goods and services out of nature for our purposes. But whatever we do has a feedback onto the natural world because we are part of it. Then the grammar of economics changes, literally. And you will have to take my word for it. And the only way I can prove it is for you to actually dip into the review, in that it affects our perception of how to think about the human economy at every level, from the individual through the household, through the community, village, region, nation, and of course the globe. In such occasions as these, the global issues loom large, as we saw in the program with Nick Stern. And I want to speak about one aspect of it only today, just to show you that no matter what you look at, your grammar that you use to interpret what you observe, what you actually observe, let alone just, and then interpret it, and then for policy, if you were so inclined, changes. I want to look at it, give you a couple of examples of it. And I want to do it very deliberately to show that there is a tension between the aspirations of the poor world. I'll use that expression because it's a factual statement. It is not a very great surprise that the world's biodiversity, much of the world's biodiversity is in the tropics. That's a fact. And it's also not, it should be a surprise that some of the world's poorest people live in the tropics, in Africa, South Asia, and so forth. This congruence has incredibly important implications for the way we view the human economy. And I want to bring out some tensions between the aspirations of the poor world, the ones I've just identified very briefly, and the perception of human possibilities in the rich world, okay? Because there is a tension, and it's no use gliding over it. There are, of course, much that can be achieved through cooperation, because there are the common good, the public goods problems is something that we think about climate change. We want to do it for, it'll be a benefit all to halt it, or to suppress it, and so forth. But I want to talk about the tension now, not those global public goods, which bring together a common framework. Yesterday at my lecture, I suggested that the right way to think about nature is to distinguish provisioning goods that Mother Nature supplies. That's food, water, timber, fibers, pharmaceuticals, and non-living material, which, when we work with them, give us the final products, which we call GDP, the sort of a talisman of economic thinking. And then to distinguish these provisioning goods from the maintenance and regulating services that Mother Nature offers us, which is the basis for all our lives. And these are pollination, carbon sequestration, this climate change, climate regulation, nitrogen fixation, decomposition of waste, and so many other things, cleansing of water, the natural processes by which that happens. Now, these services are the bedrock, and I want to talk about that a little bit and show you how the grammar changes. Currently, globally, crude estimates though they are, the demand we make on these services is about 1.7 times the ability of Mother Nature to supply them on a sustainable basis. And you've heard of the expression that we need 1.7 Earths to meet our demand. It sort of crops up every now and then in newspapers. Well, that's the expression. So I want you to think about those services, maintenance and regulating services, as a gigantic set of benefits that we receive, furnishes the entire substructure of our biosphere. And we are making demands on them because the reason we are making demands on them is that we're making demands on the provisioning goods, because they are the ones which generate our GDP. And the provisions goods are only being supplied by these maintenance and regulating services so that to the extent that we may put pressure on the provisioning goods, puts pressure on these demands. So there's a tension between the provisioning goods and the maintenance and the regulating services. Mining, quarrying, land use changes, conversion of forests into plantations and so forth are ways by which we eat into these the maintenance and regulating services. But that's because we want the provisioning goods. We want to expand the provisioning goods. Okay, so that's the central dilemma of the economics of biodiversity. Okay, now here's the thing. The bulk of the footprint of the global economy, by footprint I mean demand for these maintenance and regulating services, is coming from the rich north. That's a historical fact, and that's how it's happened, and it is the case. Okay. And one of the tensions that I now observe, and I'll come to my conclusion, I just want to point out the tension, is that in recent discussions that's taking place in the UK, which is where I live, I've observed the West, or the North, if you like, let's call it the industrial countries, have essentially outsourced their need for biodiversity. Because the primary products that are imported and then transformed into final products, which are sold in the supermarkets and so forth, are of course coming from the tropics. So let me give you a sort of vulgar story of the tropics supplying the primary goods, primary products. And these primary products are the provisioning goods, we create, say, coffee beans and so forth and so on, which are then transported over. All right. Nothing wrong with that. But the only thing is, we think opening up trade and the expansion of export of primary products from the poor world to the rich world is a good thing for the poor world too, because the revenue could be used for development purposes and so forth. That's a standard story. The problem is that in the act of tapping into primary products, the neighboring ecosystems are affected. So that's the externalities that I think was slightly dismissed as being a rather uninformed notion in the opening statements we heard this morning, but those externalities are extremely powerful. What happens to one ecosystem affects another ecosystem. So if there is an over demand on one ecosystem, say the forest depletion means that there are fewer pollinators for the farmers and so forth. Okay, I don't need to elaborate on that. If you take that into account, then export of these primary products from the poor world are not priced adequately because the social cost of the production of those primary products for export are not picked up in the export price because of these externalities. Which means what? Which means that there is a transfer of wealth from the exporting country to the importing country. And if the importing country is a rich country, which I'm going to be, for my purposes here, I'm going to assume is the case, it's a very perverse kind of wealth transfer. Now, this is not a conspiratorial story at all. It's just bad economics, that's all. And it's the bad textbooks which have been governing development planning for all these 50, 60 years. And I've been, I don't mind saying this, but the last 40 years I've been trying to fight against this because in some sense we really need to change the grammar. And that grammar can be easily reconstructed. That's what I tried to show in my review. It's just getting used to that argument. So what's the one possibility, obviously, would be that there should be an export tax on primary products, which will, of course, go against the advice of the WTO. WTO wants you opening up trade, globalization, all these things are good. But the economics which supports that viewpoint, free trade is good, is dependent on an assumption that every commodity has a perfect market. But the whole point about the economics of biodiversity is that a heck of a lot of markets are missing. They're missing for a variety of reasons I don't need to go into. But the fact is that they're not inadequately priced. So we need some kind of an export tax. All right. But that can only happen if the various countries in the South cooperate to collectively impose the taxes on the export. And of course, an understanding by the recipient countries that that is a good thing. It's a good thing because it protects the biodiversity to the extent by reducing the supply of it. So that's one class of problems. And the final one, very quick one, which is one of the most recent political discussions in the UK, has been over weakening, loosening of the environmental laws that have been introduced into the UK over development purposes. That, you protect ecosystems, families of bats, bird sanctuaries, and so forth. And of course, there's a growing need for housing. So again, you have a tension now between provisioning goods and maintenance and regulating services. There's been a demand in many, there's some force in it, and it's very perfectly understandable. There's a need for housing. So the issue is, can you loosen these environmental laws? And there's some moves in that direction. The point is, of course, that it's not good enough to say then to the UK citizen that without biodiversity, the economy will collapse. The economy won't collapse. The reason is that there is not very much biodiversity in the UK anyway. The reason is that we have been able to outsource the need for biodiversity, which is the point I began with. Okay. So the only reason for not loosening it is a demonstration effect. You cannot then argue with, say, Brazil, do not deforest. Because they will say, well, look, we are going to deforest because we have to deforest because we want to earn revenue for our own development purposes. So we can't now send that, because the argument that we are giving now for housing is exactly the same. In other words, there is an economic argument, quote unquote, which overrides the biodiversity argument. Okay. So again, at every level, this is not an argument, by the way, I'm not taking a stand on whether we should or shouldn't loosen the environmental laws. It's simply that at every level of discourse, we need to correct for the fact that the language that we have inherited from economics is wrong, and we have to correct it, and it will take us in a different direction. If we do that consistently, I think we'll make a much better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think you have set out the the kind of challenges which we face in dealing with the issue of biodiversity and how it relates to the manner in which our economic systems work. Let me perhaps give a different perspective. So even in terms of the economics that we are talking about, we find, for example, with the industrialized West, a great deal of emphasis on intellectual property, because intellectual property is what generates wealth, generates income. And there is a case for very strong protection of intellectual property. If I go back to many of the discussions one has seen, for example, in the Biodiversity Convention, where we have been talking about how to preserve biodiversity, there the industrial West usually takes the opposite kind of stand, where the kind of intellectual property which is embedded in a lot of, for example, in the Eastern Himalayas, it is very, very rich in biodiversity, a lot of, herbal medicines. There are a lot of, organisms which have a intrinsic value. But in terms of putting a price on those, in fact, that is always resisted. That becomes like a common heritage of mankind. But that is not the case with respect to other, intellectual property. So there is a certain kind of, shall I say, imbalance in the manner in which we look at, what produces wealth, what produces income, and who is entitled to that income and wealth. So this is something which is very important to address, because what I see, especially in the Eastern Himalayas, that there is a tremendous loss of biodiversity which is taking place, which is creating wealth for somebody else. But it is a huge loss, a loss of capital for this region. So that is one aspect. So there is an element of injustice which has to be acknowledged, and it has to be addressed. Second is with respect to what we have been talking about. How do you attach value to, or how do you attach price to biodiversity resources? Now here there are our accounting systems, for example. If you just took the aspect of discounting into account, what is the rate at which you discount the future? And the whole aspect of intergenerational equity is linked to that. Now, if present consumption, present living is to be counted as much more valuable than in the future, obviously there will be a tremendous destruction of the natural wealth there, because it makes sense to use it up for meeting current needs rather than to be thinking in terms of what you leave for the future generations. So how do we adjust our accounting systems to make it more aligned with what we morally or ethically say we should be doing, that we should be taking much more into account the aspect of intergenerational equity. The other aspect is very simple. What you cannot measure doesn't count. And this is the case with a large part of our biodiversity assets, whether it is rivers or whether it is mountains. How do we the Himalayas, how do you value them? What is the price that you attach to this? Many of these things are very intangible in nature. And yet, if we have to preserve this biodiversity, we need to have some way of putting a certain price to it. Lastly, I would like to perhaps step back a little and say that the time has come where we really cannot separate things like biodiversity, say, from climate change. There are inter-domain connections which more and more we are beginning to see. And unless these are addressed in a somewhat more comprehensive manner, there is very little chance of being able to really get over this challenge. To give you a simple example, the biggest carbon sink in the world are the world's oceans. Okay. Now, the biggest problem that we are facing today is the dumping of plastics into the oceans. More and more hazardous material being dumped into the ocean because, what does it cost anybody? You just throw it into the ocean. But that means that the chemical composition of oceans are changing. That means the capacity of the oceans to actually absorb larger and larger quantities of carbon emissions is diminishing year by year. And that is, of course, a climate change impact, although it began with a biodiversity impact. So unless you look at that connection, it is very difficult to resolve this issue. Also, by the way, this also addresses another challenge which we face, which is health security. Because the fish eat microplastics, that gets into the food chain, that then affects the health of all those who are consuming that fish. So now we are beginning to see all the different interconnections which are there amongst all living systems. And that sense of that we are actually part, as you said, not man against nature, but man in nature, that particular aspect is becoming actually very, very apparent. That unless we look at those interconnections, all the fragile threads which actually link humanity together, we will not get very far. Philosophically, I saw when reading about biodiversity, that biodiversity is really like the library of life. It's the library of life which is actually being put together by millions and millions of years of evolution of a huge number of organisms going through many ecological changes on the earth as well as in our universe, And this is really the accumulated knowledge that is our legacy. And what we are doing today is really, eating into this library of life, probably reaching a point where it is irreplaceable. So while the hard sort of logic of economics always has to be kept in mind, but there is that larger picture which I think we are perhaps missing out, and to our disadvantage. Thank you.
Good morning to all of you. I think when Dr. Partha Dasgupta and Dr. Shamsaran, they have more or less covered everything with regard to a time where everything has to be turned upside down. The conventional way we have been thinking, what is economics, what is valuation, what is interconnectedness, what is the input and what goes as the output. The measurement systems are very much in place to address some of these things, which we have been doing for the last hundreds of years since the Industrial Revolution began. The institutions which are part of this thinking and the stakeholders who are part of this is also very well understood, but it has not worked. It has not worked, and numerous examples were given by both of them and the other panelists very clearly, including Sir Nicholas Stern. And corporates have also been responsible to a large extent with regard to the definition of stakeholder itself. A situation has arisen where the stakeholder definition has to start with a single individual to a village, a panchayat, a district, a city, a state, and a collectively across nations. If all these stakeholders are not part of the definition of what we want to create as a future, and we need to create this future in an accelerated manner because it has to act for all, it has to produce the kind of returns for all which saves the planet at the end of the day. That's what we are talking about. And the institutions which today drive the behavior, or the rich countries drive the behavior, is again at the cost of one or the other. And somebody is going to lose, somebody is going to win. But all of us lose because the climate change or the biodiversity is lost forever, which ultimately will result in no production or no kind of services, and the goods and services doesn't make any sense at the end of the day. What is missing, in our opinion, is for everything we need some methods of measurement, some of the tools which are relevant for the future. And we have the set of tools to address each and every one of them very clearly, very correctly, and the tools must result in some data to say that this is the proof of what we are suggesting. If the data analysis and the tools are not available, then we'll be only talking theory to say that it must be addressed, and it must be addressed very rapidly, but we don't know how to address it. So the research to the tools that become available has to be accelerated, so that's how the conventional corporates think all the time. Okay, how do I implement, and what are the kind of tools that I can do to implement, and more importantly, prove the proof of concept to a production, to a large-scale deployment, so that it touches millions of people or millions of customers or millions of communities that we need to address. Once the tools are given, then it is a question of, are they using technology for global good? Whether it is the sensor technology, whether it is the AI/MI tools, it's the digital platforms, whether it is the measure, and then keep giving the feedback loops. A systemic view is what I'm talking about at the end of the day, if you want to address any of these. Most of the programs which you do is we implement once but replicate 100 times. If the replication is possible 100 times, suddenly you see that the entire banking industry has transformed, insurance industry has transformed. But now if you take these inputs as nature as one of them, and we have the tools necessary and the technology necessary, then we can certainly replicate it across the globe. It's not that I do something and then I keep a price for it and I'll give it to you only because of the intellectual property, etc., etc. And those kinds of models will not work. I think the global commons, the global sharing, and the global wealth and the global commons is what we have talked about. And also, I think we need to take cognizance of that very, very clearly. I think the pictures that were shown this morning for Prof. Desi also, the migration of the birds or the migration of the animals, I think they have no boundaries. Whereas we as human beings have created all these artificial boundaries, and then we put a price on anything that goes when there is an artificial barrier across. Probably the institutions or also the institutional frameworks exactly address this. And the element of injustice comes out very, very clearly, and we need to turn it upside down. What are we doing in a corporate like the Tata Group is where from the initial founding, it was always sustainability as a way of life. And we lead by example through what we call as a Tata Code of Conduct, where responsibility towards the environment is a core value. And it's absolutely clear that it's a core value that is pursued relentlessly by all the group companies, which means all the employees that make a part of that, the vendors, the suppliers, pretty much everyone, day in and day out. But like said, measure, measure, measure. The efforts are to measure and reinforce through what we call as a Tata Business Excellence model, where group companies are rated just not for their business performance, but how is their sustainability journey. And now the time has come for us to accelerate and share again for global good as global commons. So I think the role of technology, the role of collective action, the role of turning problems upside down, but scaling at a much rapid pace than ever we have done. And we have compressed, just as some examples I wanted to give is, we did, it's more in a commercial context, but we did Switzerland Sega Intersettle, which was a system for a depository for the whole nation. I'm talking about 30 years ago. Then when the thought of bringing a depository into the country where all the paperless transactions or paperless share were to be done into a dematerialized form in terms of electronic records, from 5-year program which we did, we compressed it to 9 months and launched the whole product. People thought the dematerialization will never take place. For the next 10 years, we did it in 1 year. So the compression of times is what we are talking about, and that's absolutely possible if you are willing to share that knowledge, share that wealth, and make sure that it is distributed very rapidly. And the implementation is a measurement component into that. So I think the ecology and economics, all of them together, the inputs change, the outcomes are what we know, but in between what is need to be done is the speed at which we need to do, and collective minds and collective implementation, collective technology will make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you for such an insightful discussion. Now I would like to move to Sir Partha Dasgupta again, and I would like to ask you that what are few ways in which we can change our measures of economic success, and what kind of capacity building is needed for that locally, nationally, and regionally? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This has been one of the few successes of this new economics, if you like, embedding the story about the analytical, the grammar of thinking about the human economy is the success has been the advocacy of wealth measurement of wealth. Adam Smith, who's the founding father of our discipline, spoke about the wealth of nations and wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. He didn't talk about the GDP of nations. That wasn't a concept that he was used to. Now, the notion of wealth, of course, is far richer today than it was at Smith's time. That's for sure, because that's what we are discussing here. We're including a whole bunch of an entire category of capital assets, ecosystems, whether it's wetlands or mangroves or whatever, including in that. And that's been a success in the sense that countries are now moving in that direction. The Office of National Statistics in the UK is vigorously working in creating a parallel set of natural capital accounts with all the caveats and difficulties, missing prices and so forth. But it's something that is now in the air in international communities. India is moving in that direction. It's not to abandon the idea of GDP, because it's extremely useful for short-run macroeconomic management problems. But GDP was not invented for the purpose of measuring economic success over the long run. It was never the intention. It was part and parcel of short-run macroeconomic management of a Keynesian variety. It's invented by Simon Kuznets back in the late 30s, mid-40s. We should be measuring wealth, an inclusive measure of wealth, that is natural capital, human capital, and produced capital like buildings and roads and so forth, and aggregate them and see how it's moving with time relative to the population. That's happening. Now I'll talk about something which is not quite happening, but it's related to the measurement issue. And it's a point that you raised about discount rates that governments ought to use for assessing development projects or any kind of investment. I'm not talking about the private sector, I'm talking about government now. So the discount rate we're talking about is what is very often called social rates of discount. Okay. Now, if you ask yourself what the discount rate means, it's asking the following question. In some sense, how much of income are you willing to give up today? And what compensation do you need for, say, 10-year income 10 years from now? Now, the natural tendency, if you ask that question and not ask what the market rate of interest is or what the productivity of capital is, just ignore that. I'm just simply asking, how much are you willing to give up today for 10 years from now? Okay, what's the trade-off? Now, in answering that question, even at the individual level, you'll ask, am I going to be richer 10 years from now, or am I going to be poorer in 10 years' time? If I'm richer, then the distributional issues included over time, you would say I would need more than some compensation for giving up a unit today, because I'll need it less. A unit will be less valuable in 10 years' time because I expect to be richer. That's the argument, which means the discount rate is positive. And of course, it's complete convention now to use positive discount rates in thinking about, say, estimating the social cost of carbon. Nick Stern was talking about the fact that there's no competition between climate change and biodiversity. The answer is yes, there is a competition in the way climate change economics has been fashioned. Because the assumption behind the entire literature on the economics of climate change, whether it's Nordhaus or Stern or whatever, is that the future is going to be rosier than it is today, hence the positive discount rate. But suppose you take climate science very seriously, or biodiversity law seriously, and say, well, look, there are some real dangers ahead. So remember, our demand for Mother Nature's goods and services, the services that I mentioned, is vastly greater than her ability to supply. So there may be collapses ahead. And in the climate change literature is pointing to that collapse by saying, well, look, if it's 3 degrees, 4 degrees above, then we're going to be playing havoc. Now, suppose you think there's a reasonable risk that we were going to have serious difficulties 50 years down the road. Well, then we're going to be poorer. Hence, the discount rate that you'd be using will be negative. That's exactly right. That is, I'll ask for less tomorrow than what I give up, because I need a lot more tomorrow because I'll be a lot poorer. Just the reverse argument. It's nothing paradoxical about it. If I'm going to be poorer tomorrow, then I'll be willing to take less for what I give up now. Now, negative interest rate means what? The discount rate means that you amplify the damages of the future. You don't discount it and get to the paradoxical result that it doesn't matter if there will be a huge damage 50 years from now because at 2%, 3% discount rate, it looks very negligible now. That paradox arises only because we are doing our economics badly. If you follow the economic logic, then social discount rates can be negative if you think there are real dangers lying ahead, in which case there's no inconsistency in the way you think about managing the future. Okay.
You have time? I think we have to wind up. So let me just say a few concluding words. The way I look at it, and not as a professional economist, but the way I look at it is that, it's a question of, does price determine value, or does value determine price? So ultimately, to me, it would appear that what underlies the kind of issues that you have raised, why has economics not, in fact, done this better, is precisely, I think, because the value system that we are living by has not allowed us to do that. So if, for example, take our own country like India, it has a traditional kind of a civilizational attribute, which in fact value sustainability. That is, don't take from Mother Nature what she is not able to regenerate. So that determines, what is the level at which you do your extraction in a sense. Secondly, you take a more recent example. You had the pandemic, you had supply chains disruptions, and suddenly, the balance between efficiency and reliability changed. So while much of our modern economic system was based on, just-in-time, production processes, raw materials should not be, kept in reserve. There should not be inventories because you can do this very, very quickly with the kind of logistics systems that you have. And yet, when you had a disruption, suddenly people became aware of the value of reliability, the value of having some kind of risk aversion. And immediately, therefore, the value of that changed in a sense. That it was no longer a loss in order to actually keep inventories. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the price. I think the way to look at pricing and how do we do the right kind of pricing. Ultimately, we have to look at the value system underlying it. And I think much of what you see, finally, I would like to point out, whether it is the 5th IPCC assessment or whether it's the 6th IPCC assessment, finally, they have come to the point that unless there is a civilizational response, unless there is a whole of society response, it is very difficult to see whether we can really meet the targets that we have set ourselves, for that 1.5 or even less. Thank you.
Well, be as short as possible. I think yesterday somebody touched upon it to say that unless our consumption behavior changes, the demands on nature will only increase. The consumption and the conspicuous consumption and a demand explosion we are seeing even for a short period during the COVID, it was less because of the supply chain disruptions, but it has come with a big bang in terms of demand on the needs. Second thing is this inequality in terms of the wealth versus not wealthy is only again exploding, which is a very, very serious issue across the globe. So to address some of these things, how do you build the capacity, how do you understand these challenges has to be understood. But the one point which Dr. Shamsaran also made, civilizational culture with regard to how do you do more with less. Simple thing, but it has to be incorporated or institutionally made as a way of life. So that the questions we need to ask are, why do I need 5 houses? Why do you need one house with 8 rooms? I think we had to go back to these fundamentals to ask some of these things. And as Dr. Shamsaran said, the value change and the value systems had to go again back to what we grew up with or what we thought through. And unless that changes, we are not going to achieve anything other than more consumption, more demand, and more problems for nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all three of you for such a great discussion. I think it's prime time that we really understand the value of nature and we really transform our institutions so that we can better cope with this climate crisis and at the same time really embed the value of nature in also our education system so that the young generation can understand the cost of it. Thank you so much and have a great rest of the day.